Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Yogaha karmasu kaushalam.
Hello students, my name is Ishan Shinolikar and today we will be discussing about Theory of Distribution Part 2. Let us start with the objectives of the session. First we will understand the theory of rent, then we will move on to the theory of interest rate. Further, we look at the theory of profit and finally we look at the modern approaches to distribution. Let us start with the first topic, that is theory of rent. We begin with the classical theory of rent. The classical theory of rent was developed by David Ricardo, which explains rent as payment for the use of natural resources, particularly land. According to this theory, rent arises because different prices of land have different levels of fertility and productivity. Ricardo argued that rent is determined by the difference between the productivity of a particular piece of land and the productivity of marginal least productive land in the use. The best land earns high rent because it's much more productive than marginal land. This theory suggests that rent is not a cost of production but rather a surplus that arises from superior quality of better land. Rent exists because land quality varies and the supply of high quality land is limited in nature. Let us understand economic rent versus commercial rent. Economic rent refers to payments above what we would be necessary to keep a factor in its current use. It represents surplus earnings beyond the minimum amount needed to maintain production. Commercial rent is the actual payment made for using property or resources, which may include both economic rent and normal returns to investment in improvements. Understanding this distinction helps explain why some locations command high rents while others don't, and why rent levels can vary dramatically even for smaller properties vary to a large extent. Let us now look at modern rent theory. Modern rent theory extends beyond land to include any payment for resource in fixed supply. This broader concept includes rents earned by talented individuals, valuable patents, prime locations, and any resource that cannot be easily replicated. Quasi-rent refers to temporary surplus earnings that arise from short-term supply limitations. For example, skilled workers might earn quasi-rent during periods when their skills are high demanded, but training programs haven't yet increased supply. Monopoly rent arises when market power allows resource owners to charge above competitive levels. This can occur with patented technologies, exclusive locations, or any resource controlled by single owner. Let us now look at factors determining rent levels. So location characteristics strongly influence rent levels, with proximity to markets, transportation networks, and economic centers commanding higher rents. Urban land typically earns higher rent than rural land due to greater economic activity. Productivity differences create rent variations even for similar resources. More fertile agricultural land earns higher rent than less fertile agricultural land because it can produce more output with same amount of inputs. Zoning regulations, development rights, and government policies affect rent levels by limiting supply or changing permitted uses for land and other resources. Let us now look at the applications in modern economy. Understanding rent theory helps explain real estate markets, natural resource pricing, and returns to unique assets. It provides insights into urban development patterns and regional economic differences. The concept of economic rent is crucial for understanding executive compensation, sports salaries, and payments to celebrities who earn far more than what would be necessary to keep them in their current activities. Rent theory also helps analyze the effects of taxation and regulation on resource allocation and income distribution. This was the theory of rent. Now let us move to the theory of interest. Let us look at the nature and definition of interest rate. Interest represents the price paid for the use of capital or loanable funds over time. It compensates capital owners for postponing consumption and taking risks associated with lending or investing their money. Interest serves multiple economic functions. It allocates capital among competing uses, provides incentives for saving, and compensates for the time preference between present and future consumption. The interest rate acts as a signal in capital markets, directing funds towards their most productive uses and balancing the supply of savings with the demand for investment funds. Let us now look at the classical theories of interest. First is the abstinence theory. This was developed by Nassau Senior. This theory argues that interest compensates capital owners for abstaining from present consumption. Saving requires sacrifice of current enjoyment, and interest provides compensation for this sacrifice. Next is productivity theory. This theory suggests that interest reflects the productivity of capital in production processes. Capital equipment encourages output, and interest represents a share of this increased productivity. Further, we have time preference theory. Irving Fisher's theory emphasizes that people generally prefer present consumption to future consumption. Interest compensates for this time preference, including people to making them save and further invest. Next, we have the loanable funds theory. The loanable funds theory explains interest rates through the intersection of supply and demand in capital markets. The supply of loanable funds comes from savings done by households, businesses, and governments. The demand for loanable funds comes from businesses seeking investment capital, consumers wanting loans, and governments financing expenditures. The interest rate adjusts to balance these supply and demand forces. This theory helps explain how monetary policy, government borrowing, and economic conditions affect interest rates and capital allocation in the economy. Now let us look at certain factors affecting interest rates. First, we have risk factors. High risk investments require higher interest rates to compensate investors for the additional uncertainty. Government bonds typically offer lower interest rates than corporate bonds, which offer lower rates than speculative investments. Next, we have time period. So longer term investments typically require higher interest rates to compensate for increased uncertainty and the longer postponement of returns. Further, inflation expectations also play a role. When inflation is expected, nominal interest rates rise to maintain the profitability or real returns for the investors. High inflation periods typically coincide with high interest rates. During economic booms, strong demand for capital typically raises the interest rate. During recessions, weak investment demand and monetary policy typically lowers the interest rates. Central bank policies significantly influence interest rates through money supply, management, reserve requirement, and direct rate setting. Now let us differentiate between real and nominal interest rates. Nominal interest rates are the stated rates without adjusting for inflation. Real interest rates subtract expected inflation from nominal rates, showing the actual purchasing power returns to investors. Real interest rates better reflect the true cost of borrowing and return to lending because they account for how inflation erodes the value of money over time. Understanding this distinction is crucial for investment decisions, loan evaluation, and economic analysis during periods of changing inflation. Now let us move to the theory of profit. First we start with understanding economic profit. So economic profit differs from accounting profit by considering opportunity cost of all resources used in production, including the entrepreneur's time and capital. It represents returns above what would be earned in the next best alternative use. Accounting profit simply subtracts explicit costs from revenue, while economic profit also subtracts implicit costs like the opportunity cost of entrepreneurs' own resources. Economic profit serves as a signal for resource allocation in market economies. Positive economic profits attract new entrants to industries, while negative economic profits encourage exits. Now let us try and understand the sources of profit. Innovation and entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs who develop new products, services, or business production methods can earn profits by creating value that they didn't previously see. These innovation profits reward creativity and risk-taking behavior. Businesses venture involves uncertainty about outcomes. Profit partly compensates entrepreneurs for bearing these risks that employed workers and lenders typically do not face. Temporary monopolies, information advantages, or other market imperfections can generate profits above competitive levels. These profits often diminish as markets become more and more competitive. Further, firms that operate more efficiently than competitors can earn profits by producing at lower costs while selling at market prices. Let us now look at the functions of profit in an economy. Profit serves as an incentive for entrepreneurship and innovation, encouraging people to start businesses and develop new ideas. Without profit opportunities, there would be less innovation and economic progress. Profits guide resource allocation by signaling which activities create the most value. Industries with high profits attract resources, while unprofitable industries lose resources to more valuable ones. Profit also provides funding for business expansion and future investment. Companies use retained earnings to finance growth and development projects. Now let us look at theories of profit. First we have the dynamic theory. This theory argues that profits arise from economic changes and disruptions. Entrepreneurs who successfully anticipate and adapt to changes earn profits, while those who fail to adapt suffer losses. Uncertainty theory. Developed by Frank Knight, this theory distinguishes between insurable risks and true uncertainty. Profits represent rewards for bearing uninsurable uncertainty for future outcomes. Joseph Schumpeter developed something known as innovation theory, which emphasized that profits reward entrepreneurs who introduce innovations that disrupt existing market and create new value for consumers. Further, monopoly theory suggests that monopolistic markets allow sustained profits because barriers to entry prevent competition from eliminating excess returns. This explains why some companies maintain high profitability over long periods. Oligopolistic markets may generate sustained profits through strategic behavior and barriers to entry, though competitive pressures still constrain profit levels. Now let us understand the last topic of this session, that is modern approaches to distribution. First we have institutional economics perspective. Institutional economists emphasize how laws, regulations, social norms, and organizational structures affect income distribution. They argue that distribution outcomes depend not just on market forces but also on institutional frameworks. Labor unions, professional associations, government regulations, and corporate governance structures all influence how income is distributed among different groups in society. This perspective helps examine why similar economies with different institutional structures can have very different income distribution patterns. Next we have human capital theory. Human capital theory treats education, training, and skill development as investments that increase worker productivity and justify higher wages. This theory explains much of the observed variation in wages across different individuals and occupations. The theory suggests that wage differences largely reflect differences in human capital investments rather than unfair discrimination of market imperfections. Workers who invest more in education and skills earn higher wages on average. However, critics note that access to education and training opportunities is not equal. This further raises questions about whether wage differences truly reflect merit or simply reflect unequal starting points. Now let us try and understand bargaining power theory. This theory emphasizes that factor rewards depend partly on the relative bargaining power of different groups rather than just the productive contributions. Workers with strong unions or scarce skills can negotiate higher wages than their marginal productivity might suggest. Similarly, capital owners with essential resources or technologies may capture returns above what pure competition would provide. Bargaining power reflects legal frameworks, market structures, and strategic positioning. This theory helps explain why some groups consistently earn more than others even when productivity differences don't seem to justify the income gaps. Next, we have network effects and platform economics. Modern digital economies create new forms of distribution based on network effects and platform structures. Platform owners can capture significant value by facilitating connections between users rather than directly producing goods or services. These new business models challenge traditional distribution theory because value creation and capture do not follow conventional factor distribution or contribution patterns. Platform effects can create winner-take-all outcomes that concentrate income. Understanding these modern patterns requires extending traditional distribution theory to handle network effects, data assets, and digital platform dynamics. Further, we also have the effect of globalization and factor mobility. Increased global integration affects distribution by allowing factors of production to move freely across borders. Capital mobility has increased dramatically while labor mobility remains more limited. Globalization can reduce returns to factors that become more abundant through international movement while increasing returns to factors that remain scarce. This creates new patterns of winners and losers from global integration. Trade in goods and services also affects factors returns by changing the effective supply and demand for different types of production activities. Next, technological change, particularly automation and artificial intelligence, is altering traditional relationships between factors of production. Some types of labor are being replaced while others are becoming more valuable. These changes affect the distribution of income between capital owners and workers, potentially increasing returns to capital while reducing returns to routine labor. However, technology also creates new types of work and can increase the productivity of remaining workers. Understanding how technology affects distribution is crucial for predicting future income patterns and developing appropriate policy responses to technical or technological displacement. In terms of policy implication, distribution theory provides framework for evaluating policies aimed at affecting income distribution. Progressive taxation, minimum wage laws, education subsidies, and transfer programs all work through the mechanism described in distribution theory. Understanding distribution theory helps policymakers design more effective interventions and predict the consequences of policy changes. It also helps evaluate whether observed income patterns reflect efficient resource allocation or market failures requiring correction. The theory also guides thinking about optimal taxation and trade-offs between equality and efficiency in economic policy design. Now, if we summarize the session, then theory of distribution provides comprehensive understanding of how economic rewards are determined and distributed. Distribution theory explains how total economic output is divided among different factors of production based on their contribution, market conditions, and institutional frameworks. Each factor of production, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur, receives specific types of rewards determined by different economic principles and market conditions. The central principle of factors receiving compensation equal to their marginal contribution to output provides the foundation for understanding competitive factor pricing. Labor markets have unique characteristics that create complex wage determination patterns involving productivity, bargaining power, and institutional factors. Payments for natural resources and unique assets reflect scarcity, location advantage, and productivity differences that cannot be easily replicated. Capital returns compensate for time preference, risk-taking, and productivity contributions with rates determined by supply and demand in capital markets. Entrepreneurial returns reward innovation, risk-taking, and superior efficiency while providing signals for resource allocation and incentives for economic progress. Contemporary extensions address human capital, technological change, globalization, and digital economy effects on traditional distribution patterns. Thus, understanding distribution theory is essential for business students who will make compensation decisions, evaluate investment opportunities, and navigate the complex relationships between value creation and income distribution in modern economies. I hope you understood and enjoyed the session. Thank you so much.